All right. We are continuing our study in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. We've studied how Solomon is moving on to describe the nature of wisdom, the importance of understanding how wisdom applies certainly within the roles that we have in this life, and certainly how wisdom can be affected by choices that we make. Verse 1, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. There are two ways in which we can cause wisdom to be, diluted to a certain extent. There are two ways in which this is being applied. One way that we see in verse 1, or at least one application of this, certainly is to make bad decisions. Bad decisions certainly add dead flies to any kind of ointment, especially when it refers to a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. Folly certainly applies to my actions, the choices that I make, the example that I set, especially if I'm respected as someone who, maybe not even necessarily respected, but simply somebody who is acknowledged as being spiritually minded, maybe at work or whatever, and then I make a decision or say something in such a way that goes against that example. That certainly can have an effect with regard to wisdom and honor as it pertains to influence. And then the second application is certainly allowing ourselves to surround ourselves with people who don't make good decisions, kind of guilty by association, so to speak. The sense in which we surround ourselves with people who give themselves to folly, as Solomon would put it, that would cause us to put ourselves in compromising situations, and certainly would not be a wise way to function. And that's part of what verse 1 is describing. Anything else through verse 1? Verse 2. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left, or a fool's heart at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. The idea of right hand and left hand throughout the New Testament, it's not that left-handed people are bad, but it's the idea that typically right hand throughout the Bible represents power, it represents authority, it represents wisdom. Left hand represents folly, it represents a lack of wisdom, weakness. It's the kind of the differentiation between righteous and wicked a lot of times. And so here in verse 2, a wise man's heart is at his right hand, and a fool's at his left. What does that mean? What is he talking about, verse 2? A wise man's heart.
When the right hand seeketh by close by, ready to make use of it, listen to it. He's going to listen to the wisdom, follow what it says.
Okay. And of course, what does that speak to regarding the heart of the wise versus the fool? Sorry? Yeah. There's this idea of wisdom and honor being carried through into verse 2. But a wise man's heart is at his right hand. In other words, his heart is set on God. He knows what he's supposed to be doing, and that gives him stability. It gives him power in the sense that he knows what he's doing. He knows what his goal is. And as opposed to a fool whose heart is at his left hand, his heart is given over to folly. It's given over to enjoying this life and not worrying about what God wants. And so that is the differentiation between the hearts, is that, just as Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? And this concept carries through even here as Solomon describes a man's heart. This is a wise man's heart's at his right hand. It helps to ground him, and it helps to motivate him, to help him to remember what his focus needs to be. And of course, it serves the exact opposite for a fool. Anything else through verse 2? Verse 3. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom. He shows everyone he's a fool. Of course, this has parallels in Proverbs and so forth about better to keep your mouth shut. How does the saying go? Help me out, y'all. Better not to say anything at all and have people think that you're a fool as opposed to opening your mouth and remove all doubt, that type of thing that we say a lot of times. This kind of carries along with that idea. And ultimately what it is it surrounds the idea that a fool ultimately, he ends up showing himself. Okay, and in a lot of ways, it kind of carries out even into what Jesus describes about by their works you shall know them, by their fruits you will know them, regarding false teachers, specifically false prophets that Jesus was explaining there. But the idea of people who are not sincere, people who attempt to hide their intentions and their agendas, generally speaking, at some point in time, their true purpose, their true heart will shine through. At some point, they're going to mess up, they're going to make a mistake, and eventually it'll show. And that's going to be true in pretty much all walks of life. And here in verse 3, even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom. How does he show everyone he's a fool? Okay, the way he acts, the way he, in a lot of ways, this reference, the way he walks along the way, he walks without purpose. Okay, he meanders. All right? He doesn't have any direction, is the idea. He lacks wisdom in the way that he walks, is the concept. He shows everyone he's a fool by his lack of direction, by his lack of understanding of what he's supposed to be doing. And so certainly there is how he acts. Certainly his words would be a part of it as well. But what Solomon's pointing out is the extent of which a fool shows himself to be a fool. He doesn't even necessarily have to say anything. Just by his actions or lack of actions, that can show forth the attitude and the mindset of an individual. And certainly wisdom isn't to be related to, or lack of wisdom, is not to be related to intelligence. Okay, we're talking about two completely different things. Wisdom is the idea of acknowledging, especially in context of what Solomon's dealing with. Wisdom, and in particular godly wisdom, is understanding that God wants me to live this type of a life. This is what He wants me to do, and I need to focus on Him. It has nothing to do with book smarts. It has nothing to do with having street smarts even. It has everything to do with the concept of proper perspective and proper priority. And so it's not that, this person doesn't know much. He lacks intelligence or he lacks knowledge. That's not what Solomon's describing. Wisdom and folly, in particular, have to deal with our focus in life and our priorities, our perspective, and how we live. Anything through verse 3.
Actually, one thing that we can relate to weather predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Weather predictors are not always correct, but quite frequently they are
Yeah.
close to right. And if it's a hot day, the weather is predicted to get cold, then you're foolish if you don't carry clothes that would keep you warm along the way.
Common sense, right? Yep.
You might not need them, but if the front hits, you need it, especially up in this area.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in a lot of ways, the idea of wisdom carries with it the idea of common sense. And of course, the point of that is that both the foolish and the wise, it's not like they don't have a choice in the matter. The very point that Solomon's making is that they do have a choice, but they have chosen the paths that they take. The wise have chosen to apply common sense. The wise have chosen to pursue a life serving God, whereas the fool, it's not that he can't help it. So, it's not like, who are we to really condemn him? It's not like he can help it. He's just, he doesn't really understand. That's not what Solomon's describing when it comes to folly or it comes to the lack of wisdom. It's the choices that he makes specifically that are attributed to being foolish. He's choosing that path as opposed to choosing the path of serving God. Yes, sir.
part of Solomon's point here is that wisdom and folly are not discerned just in the great decisions of life.
Sure.
Or public decisions.
Yep.
It's when he walks along the way you can tell he's a fool.
Right.
When he opens his mouth, makes just an offhand comment, you can tell.
Right.
It's between the wise man and the fool. It doesn't take that much investigation to find the fool.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. And certainly within verse 3, it kind of goes back to verse 1 in that there's that application about our choices and our actions, making sure we don't throw in these dead flies ourselves, but also from the perspective of who we choose to allow in our inner circle, so to speak, that circle of influence, that realm of influence that we allow people to be with us in this world. And when we allow individuals, and that's kind of part of what verse 3 is about, the wise man's, his entire focus is completely different from the foolish man. And that's part of the point, is that the fool, he makes it clear by his actions, by his words, what his purpose in life is, what his focus is. And the wise man and the fool, they don't have anything in common, at least in terms of the spiritual pursuit of serving God. There is nothing in common. There's no common ground there. And so to a certain extent, there is a little bit of that going back to verse 1 and allowing these influences in our lives. Well, are we, and by saying allowing, we're in the world, but we're not of the world, right? We're going to have acquaintances. We're going to even have friends at work or at school that maybe aren't pursuing a life seeking to serve God. Okay, that's going to happen. But when we talk about, remember we talked before, when we were getting ready, preparing our children to go back to school, and we talked about the importance of who we call a friend. Okay, and in particular, the idea of a friend being someone that we allow within that realm of influence, that we allow their example to influence us, and that we have to be very careful who we let into that circle, because we can very easily make a poor choice and allow an evil influence to affect us. And this seems to be kind of a part of that too, because verse 3, you can tell, just as James said, it doesn't necessarily take the big decisions and a fool really, because of his foolishness, because of his folly, he's not going to be able to hide it for long. Okay, you'll be able to tell. You'll be able to see. Anything else through verse 3? Verse 4, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. Now, it's interesting, and I haven't mentioned him in a while because I kind of feel like he got off a little bit of track, but the commentator that I had referenced in the past, Garrett, in his commentary on Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, he believes that since chapter 8, all of chapter 8, chapter 9, and really up until verse 10 of chapter 10 is all about being in a position of a counselor to the king. Okay, that's how he perceives all of the wisdom that's being explained is in that role of being a counselor to a king. And there really isn't, he doesn't apply any aspect of it to anyone else. It's kind of specific to that. And I disagree. I don't think that's the case. But there are certain parts of it that kind of bring out aspects of what happens when our civil responsibilities and our service to God kind of coincide. Okay, well, what happens when, for instance, as we talked about earlier in chapter 8, with regard to the king and the king's wrath, and how should we react? What should we do about these issues that may arise? And we talked about that then. Well, this comes up here in verse 4. If the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post. The idea here is not that the ruler is against your desire to serve God. Okay, that's not the point that Solomon's making. His point is that the ruler is angry about something. Okay, whether you've done anything wrong. In fact, that's not really even the context that I've made a mistake or I've done something wrong. It's just that the ruler's angry. Okay? And of course, Solomon has described rulers and kings as being kind of fickle anyway, in terms of their being angry and not being angry and so forth. That's kind of how he tends to kind of describe, at least not necessarily godly rulers. but rulers of man tend to be fickle. And this is part of that process. If the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post. Don't run. Don't run. Okay? Don't abandon the responsibilities that you have for conciliation. We're familiar with reconciliation, right? What is conciliation?
It's sort of like console. I mean, and the next word, pacify, I mean, just make yourself amenable or,
There you go.
you know.
Yeah. A desire to stop the anger of another, to mediate, okay, to attempt to calm somebody down. Yes, ma'am.
The New American says because composure allays great offenses.
Right. Composure. And the idea is certainly, it speaks to, there's a King James term that sometimes we don't use very often anymore, countenance. Okay, our countenance, our bearing. How we handle the king's wrath is specifically what Solomon is describing here. Do not leave your post. In other words, the responsibilities that you have, you still serve those because the king gets angry over some offense, perceived offense, not that you've done anything wrong. Okay, in every commentary I've read about this, there is no suggestion here that you've done something wrong. It's that the king's perceived you've done something wrong, or he's just simply angry over something and he's lashing out at you. Okay, or in our day and time, in our context, this might have even more specific application to an employer, okay, or something along that line, or somebody in position of authority. All right, don't leave your post. You continue to do your job. You focus on what you're supposed to do for this desire to appease, okay, the desire to be calm or be composed pacifies great offenses. And this is one of those things that applies in pretty much every walk of life, because it seems as though more and more, I was going to say more and more, it's not true. It's always been this way. But it just seems like it feels like it's more and more. We see how humans react more emotionally than they do logically, okay, and really think through things. And people jump to conclusions without getting all the facts. And so in many cases, and just in particular, you think about studying with somebody, okay, studying the Bible with somebody. And there's some application within that study that, it's not like you necessarily knew about the situation in their life or whatever, but it makes them mad because it convicts them, okay? And they get angry, and they're yelling at you, or they're calling you names of some kind. You keep your composure. Remain logical, okay? Don't allow them to, we might say, get your goat, okay? You keep yourself composed. Generally speaking, okay, that individual, if they're going to be amenable to talking about it, they will compose themselves too. Sometimes people, they just get into an emotional state and they kind of react. All right, and that happens. And some of us may have varying degrees of control sometimes when it comes to our own emotional reactions. And so this is part of what Solomon is describing. He's describing the wisdom of keeping your composure even in the face of someone who's angry at you, the face of a ruler or someone in authority. Keep your composure, because it can go a long way to helping someone to calm down and to be able to deal with whatever the situation is. Meaning through verse 4. Verse 5. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, as an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. At this point, Solomon, when he's talking about the idea of folly and rich, and then servants and princes, we're not talking about literal servants or princes. We're talking about figurative in the sense of foolish versus wise. Okay, that is still that's the kind of the idea that he's bringing forth. So verse 5, he sees this evil. And again, this evil is not from God. This evil is generally, in fact, throughout Ecclesiastes, the evils that Solomon perceives are one of two things. They're evils in the sense that man perceives something of life as being unfair, okay, because it's out of man's control, or it's because of something man does. And in this case, that's kind of the consideration. As an error proceeding from the ruler. Some of these times that people in authority make bad decisions. And the choices they make of exalting the foolish over the wise is borne out in the decisions that ultimately are made by these foolish ones. He says, folly is set in great dignity. A lot of times people who are fools are exalted because they have some relationship with the ruler, some relationship with the person in authority. And those people get exalted over the ones who are perhaps more qualified. All right? While the rich, not necessarily physically rich, because we know that he's made the case before that the physically rich often seek to kind of oppress those who are poor. So while the rich sit in a lowly place, he's speaking in terms of wisdom. Okay, those who truly are wise, those who truly are of a better stature, of a better composure, better understanding, they remain in the lowly place mainly because, in attached to their wisdom, they don't promote themselves. They don't exalt themselves. Whereas the fool, that's pretty much all he does. He tries to emphasize, say all these words. There's no substance to them, but he's noticed. Okay, and a lot of times, in some cases, depending on what the situation is, sometimes that's enough. Is name recognition, being noticed, is enough. And so somebody may think you're qualified for something when you're not. I have seen servants on horses, which is to say being on the horse is the idea of kind of riding above everybody else. It's a place of honor, place of dignity. I've seen servants on horses, which is to say these individuals, they should be servants. These are people that are foolish, they make bad decisions, they don't have understanding, and yet they're in these places of authority, while princes, individuals who should be in authority, individuals who do have wisdom and understanding, they walk on the ground like servants. And again, it's not because they have chosen that path, it is an error proceeding from the ruler. And this is simply a state of life, okay, as it relates to man. Because sometimes, no matter what it may be, whether it's politics, whether it's employers, sometimes our bosses make bad choices. That happens. And depending on our roles and our ability to speak to our bosses, sometimes we might be able to provide some insight. I really don't think this is a good idea. But ultimately, when the boss says, this is what we're going to do you have any choice? No. You got to do it. And then ultimately, when it comes back to bite them, maybe, hopefully, they'll learn from that lesson and understand, okay, you knew ahead of time, maybe I should put you in this position instead of this other person. Okay, but this is one of the evils that Solomon observed with regard, and of course this is all about folly versus wisdom. Okay? And the fact that the wisdom that we seek to have in this world, specifically regarding our service to God, will set an example regarding how others see us. Okay? And that's part of what verse 1 was all about, is be careful, because if you're respected for wisdom and honor, be careful to maintain that state and that reputation. Don't allow things to cause a problem because of these things. Because there's specific ways in which having that reputation of wisdom and honor can be a benefit. Not just for you, but for others as well. Anything through verse 7. Verse 8. So verse 8, 9, 10, and 11 are... They're... The term that is used to describe these are aphorisms. They're examples that kind of tell an underlying moral, so to speak. These are kind of similar to the Proverbs. Okay, that's really what these are. They're kind of like Proverbs. But notice the reason why Solomon says the things that he says at this point. Verse 8, he who digs a pit will fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them. He who splits wood may be endangered by it. Okay, Solomon, thank you. What does that mean?
I don't know if it's what he's getting at, but I'm going to pay attention.
Okay, all right, pay attention.
There's risk with everything, but that's not necessarily what he's getting at. It's just,
Okay, so let's focus in on that idea of risk with everything. In particular, what's the risk involved? What is Solomon emphasizing regarding the role that is being performed by the individual? Okay, there's some work that you're involved in, right? So what's the danger? What's the risk?
Or maybe oftentimes we set up things for ourselves that then in turn hurt us.
Okay, all right. So there's actually two aspects to this, okay? One is, no matter what role you perform or responsibilities you have in this world, sometimes without even having anything to do with it, sometimes those things will bite you, all right? Those things will come back and cause problems for you. Not because you did anything wrong, but simply because the nature of the job carries with it a certain amount of risk, okay? Sometimes we say it comes with the territory, all right? Or it's the, what's the other phrase? Not the nature of the job, but it's, now there's another phrase sometimes we use. Captain Kirk would say, risk is our business, okay? This idea here, he who digs a pit will fall into it. It's not that, well, every person who digs a pit falls into it, but I have been guilty of falling into a ditch that I dug myself, okay? Because you start you're focusing on one thing, one aspect of it, and all of a sudden you lose focus, okay? And that's the other side of this. Sometimes these things will happen not because of anything you did. It's just the nature of the beast. But then other times, as was also mentioned, sometimes because this is what you do day in and day out, the danger of getting complacent and of losing focus, that can be a problem, okay? And that can cause you to suffer because you make a mistake, okay? A sloppy mistake that ordinarily you wouldn't have made, but for whatever reason you just weren't paying as much attention this time, okay? These are the two ways in which these things apply. But ultimately, the common thread is that no matter what role or responsibility you serve, it doesn't matter what role it is, there is going to be some associated risk with it. And it may not be physical danger or risk. It may be emotional or mental or even spiritual risk. Okay? I mean, we think about people in the military. And one of the important things about Christians in the military of maintaining their faith and encouraging them, because that is a very difficult place for people to be faithful to God, okay? Because of how, just the nature of what it goes with the territory, of maybe sometimes not being in a place where there's faithful Christians, because of sometimes the type of people that they're around, okay? And this is going to be true of a lot of different areas of life. So when he talks about he who quarries stones may be hurt by them, is it the stone's fault? It's not the stone's fault. It's not that the stone's meant to hurt them. It's just the nature of the job, that sometimes there's going to be accidents, or, and other times, incidents. He who splits wood may be endangered by it, but here's where verse 10 comes in, which I think, verse 10 is one of my favorite verses in all of chapter 10, because it provides such an excellent point from Solomon. If the axe is dull, and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. There's a phrase that we use all the time that kind of sums the verse 10 up. What is it? Work smarter, not harder. Okay? Work smarter, not harder. That is in essence what Solomon is describing. If the axe is dull, in fact, haven't people said, I can't think of any specifics off the top of my head, but isn't it true that a dull axe is actually more dangerous than a sharp one in many ways? Because of not only the extra exertion one has to use to be able to use a dull axe, but also sometimes people get complacent. If it's a dull, it's not very sharp. Okay, there's a lot of dangers that go along with that. And so that's part of, this is stemming off of verse 9. He who splits wood may be endangered by it. How, Solomon? Well, there's a lot of ways how. But if the axe is dull, for instance, and one does not sharpen the edge, okay, and this is one particular application of this is one's focus isn't there to recognize when the axe is dull and needs to hone that blade. Okay, so this would be on the side of people who become complacent and aren't paying attention. He must use more strength, and you never know, you could be endangered there. But wisdom says, I need to hone the axe, it's becoming dull. And then I need to respect the fact that putting myself in this position with this sharp axe can be dangerous, and I need to take appropriate common sense attached to it. And of course, all of this is, he's not talking literally about these specific things. This is all an example to understand that wisdom is a key component, because wisdom brings success no matter what your role is, no matter what your responsibilities in this life is. Wisdom brings success. You will work smarter, and not to say you don't work hard, and of course, need to emphasize that, but working with wisdom, working with common sense, that is noticed compared to people who may put a lot of effort into something, but very little gets done because they're working so hard at something that could have been done a lot easier. Because they're lacking common sense or wisdom. And so to this extent, just understand that everything, there's always inherent dangers with any position, any job, any responsibility, and even beyond employment, okay, or being a counselor to the king. Being a parent, doesn't it have certain pitfalls that we understand? Being a spouse, okay, there's certain aspects to that. Okay, now again, and it's all about having wisdom in those roles. That's what Solomon's emphasizing. Not what the roles are specifically, but having wisdom in those roles is what's so important. Anything through verse 10?
Just a quick comment. Having the right tool also
Huh.
is important, but it's got to work properly.
That's right, right. The right tool for the right job.
Hand
Yeah.
screwdriver with a flat head, you have not flat head
Right.
screw.
Right. Then you spend an hour trying to get something unscrewed when if you just went and got the right tool, it'd take 2 seconds. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Anything else through verse 10? Verse 11. The serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. Again, and verse 11, verse 12 go back to the fact that Solomon's emphasizing wisdom versus no wisdom. So the serpent may bite, and of course the serpent is being represented here by who? The fool or the wise? The fool. The serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. What does he mean by the fact that the babbler, and this is associated with foolishness, is no different? Or is he saying that we need to somehow to kind of try to appease people, and even if they're foolish and they're a babbler, that we just need to try to make them happy, and that's all we need to try to do? Is that what he's saying? Even though there certainly are people who are capable of somehow or another handling snakes, for that matter, handling lions and these tamers and so forth, ultimately, what's the nature of those animals? What are they? They're dangerous animals, aren't they? A lion is a predator. All right? These snakes, there's a certain amount of instinct that comes in. It's kind of the classic scorpion and the tortoise type of thing. Okay, scorpion gets on the tortoise's back to cross the river, halfway down, or it is a tortoise, right? He stings him, and the tortoise says, well, why did you sting me? I couldn't help it, it's in my nature. All right, there's a certain amount of instinct with regard to those types of animals. No matter how good you are at trying to appease them and to keeping them under control, they're going to bite. Okay, they're going to bite. And so this is not about suggesting that we should try to appease babblers and keep them happy. This is a warning from Solomon about those who lack wisdom. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. A babbler is no different, which is to say, stay away from them. That's what his point is. Okay? Don't get involved with babblers, and the idea of foolishness certainly is the key component here, because ultimately they talk, and they may talk to you about a bunch of other people and gossip, but what are they going to do about you when they're talking to others? Same thing. And that's just one application of the idea of babbling. Okay? Ultimately, stay away from those types of people. Okay? You can't control them. You can't tame them. Ultimately, this, for whatever reason, this is kind of how they act. It's foolish, and there's no way that you can get away scot-free with that type of relationship. Anything through verse 11. Verse 12. So obviously, remember we talked about chapter 10 kind of being one of the turning points of application of wisdom, and we're seeing a lot of practical application here from Solomon with regard, before it's always been kind of this more meta, kind of more abstract, more broad looks at the idea of wisdom of life and so forth. And now this is a little bit more like what Proverbs was, in that it's very practical ways of applying wisdom in the minds of those who are seeking to serve God. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. Okay, hold on a second. Let's split this in half. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious. What does gracious mean? Okay, kind. What goes along with kind? Forgiving, caring. Sorry? Appreciative. Okay. And of course, that idea of kind, caring, appreciative, all speaks to what type of character?
A loving character.
Loving. Someone who is, how about humble? Okay. If you speak gracious words, you're full of appreciation, you're full of love, you're full of kindness, you're forgiving. Does that speak to a humble character? Okay. Now, compare that to the lips of a fool shall swallow up the wise man? Himself. The lips of the fool will swallow himself. How so?
Doesn't apply the wisdom to keep himself out of trouble.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The idea here at the end of verse 12 is the exact opposite of everything that we just talked about. Okay? If the words of the wise is full of love and forgiveness and so forth, the words of a fool is the exact opposite of being humble. They exalt themselves. They're not forgiving. Okay? They're trying constantly to exalt themselves, so much so that they're mean to everybody else. They try to put everybody else down to make themselves seem better. Okay? And ultimately, what ends up happening to people like that? It's just talk. What ends up happening when rubber hits the pavement? In the end, there is no substance, right? There is nothing there that actually has any truth to what this individual is trying to say about themselves. Where the words of the gracious is one that is humble and thinks about others, the words of the fool only thinks about themselves. And in doing so, ultimately these words swallow him up. Because when push comes to shove, in the ways in which he lives, people realize this person, even if they're claiming to be forgiving and loving, by the way they act, it's obvious that that's not true. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, the idea of swallowing him up is the idea of ultimately they are disproven by his life. That's the idea. Okay? He kind of drowns in his own words because they don't mean anything. Anything else to verse 12? Verse 13. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. All right, so there's some specifics regarding this individual who's speaking a lot of words compared to the wise man who has gracious words and a gracious heart. He says, the words of his mouth begin with foolishness. The end of his talk is raving. What does that mean? Raving madness. The end of his talk. So it starts with foolishness. It ends with raving madness. Out of control, I think, is a great way to put that. Okay? In a lot of ways, when you don't have any way to substantiate your claims, okay, we see this in the scientific realm and the political realm a lot. When you make a claim about something, but then facts come in and show that not to be true, people generally double down on it. And they make up some excuse as to why, doesn't really apply. That doesn't take into account this and this and this. So they double down on it. Okay? And so it gets to a point where when you can't substantiate your claims any longer, now it's like they're just calling each other names. They just go, you people, or you don't listen, blah, 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 blah. And it's just words, because there's sometimes anger, frustration, because things aren't the way they want them to be. It started out with foolishness anyway. But then by the end of it, because there's nothing substantial being said, there's nothing concrete, nothing factual, in the end, they kind of come across as raving lunatics, fanatics, just madness. And I think in a lot of ways, in multiple areas of our society, we can see how that happens. It's not something that happens overnight. It is a process. But it's all about substantiating the claims of an individual. They claim that they are this and this and this, but their actions speak to something else. So what do they end up doing? They end up getting mad, calling other people names for calling them out on their stuff. Yes, ma'am.
Could this also be like, because sometimes people, they start talking and then they start getting more worked up and then start getting more, and they feed their own.
Yeah.
It just builds and builds and builds.
Certainly there's that emotional component to it as well. That, he may start out just speaking words that lack wisdom. But then the more invested he becomes, and the more people may not listen, or the more people may resist what he's saying, I think that there's a component to it where it may snowball just kind of out of control in his own thoughts, where it gets to a point because he gets frustrated, all of a sudden he's just lashing out at everything. And sure, that's one way that can apply as well. Yeah. And of course, the whole point of this is to make sure that we do what? What's Solomon's point in explaining this? Is he just talking bad about foolish people? What should you and I not do? Bad. Okay? Don't do this, because this is part of what the foolish people do. Think before you speak. Just like Joe is often to bring up in Ephesians, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Okay, I think that's a great point from Paul in Ephesians, that we should be swift to hear but slow to speak. And of course, the foolish, they get those reversed, don't they? They're swift to speak but slow to hear. All right. Anything else through verse 13? Verse 14. A fool also multiplies words. All he does is talk, talk, talk. And notice one particular aspect of the fool that he specifically talks about. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? I want you to think about, between now and next Sunday, what specific concept that these fools may be talking about. But Solomon says, why are you talking about this? You don't know what is to be. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up next Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.